If you work in dog rescue, you've likely seen the whole range. Every breed and breed mix, every behavior, every genetic issue, every medical condition, every kind of home, every kind of story, every training method, every version of a person on their best day and their worst, and every dog in the middle of it, working out where they are, whether they are safe, and who's coming back for them. My guest this week did that job, and she left it because she wasn't well. At the time, words like compassion fatigue and burnout weren't as commonly used. But during that break, she found the words for what had happened to her, and she built a course to hand those words to her friends in the sector. Jessica Dolce spent over 20 years working with animals, from dog walking to animal sheltering. She's a certified compassion fatigue and grief educator. She teaches in the shelter medicine program at the University of Florida, and she runs the Compassion in Balance program. In this episode, Jessica gives concrete, practical strategies to help you look after yourself. And towards the end, we get into ethics and morality, because in this work, that is the fuel. It's what got you through the door in the first place and what made you believe that you could change something in the world. So whatever the culture is where you work, stopping is hard. Pausing is hard, boundaries are hard, and looking after yourself is the hardest because some part of you is always going to be calculating what an hour off or a day off or a week off means for the dogs. So whatever you're doing, I really hope that this helps. This is Just a Dog Podcast, and I'm your host, Nadine. One note before we start, this episode covers animal cruelty, euthanasia, and trauma. Please take care of yourself while you listen. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, Nadine. It's nice to meet you.
So nice to meet you. How are you so far today?
Good. I just got in from walking the dog, so I'm nice and sweaty and they're asleep. So hopefully they'll be quiet.
I usually start the conversation by getting to know you a bit more as a person outside or away from the work that you do. So let's start with the story of what led you to dogs. What was your childhood like? Did you have loads of dogs in your childhood?
Okay, yeah. So my very first dog, I was 5 years old, and he was a West Highland White Terrier named Duncan. And I know that my mom bought him from a pet store at a shopping center, like a mall, because this was the very early 80s. And that's where you got your dogs back then. And he was a surprise. I came home from school one day and he was there, and it was a dream come true. I'm an only child. So Duncan and I grew up together. He was with me until I was 20 years old and in college. So he was my dog my whole life growing up. And right after getting him, we found out I was allergic to dogs. And bless my mom, she was like, we'll just figure it out. So we found ways to make it work. And Duncan stayed with me despite the fact that he made me sneeze a lot. And we just had a great friendship. And I think he is the reason why I always prefer and gravitate towards terriers and really silly high drive dogs, because he was 20 pounds of naughty, playful energy. And that was my first dog growing up. And then the next dog in my life really wasn't until I think I was out of college. I think for a lot of us, right? Until we start making our way in our own life and we have our own place. And at first I just had cats, and it wasn't until much later, really in my 20s, that I had the chance to have my own dog again. And I adopted a beagle named Birdie, and she was my first dog that was all mine. And then it's been a whole series of pit bulls ever since. So just much larger versions of Duncan, 60 and 70 pound versions of that terrier that I grew up with. But along the way, I was a professional dog walker for over 20 years. And so even during the times when I didn't have my own dogs, I was always taking care of other people's dogs. And they've just always been a really important part of my life. They're my coworkers and my friends and my family members. So when I think of any part of my life, there's a dog right next to me at work or at home.
That's a life well lived, I would say. So with your dog walking, what got you into that? Was that before you went to college and throughout?
It was right after college. I just started my own pet sitting and dog walking business. I was living in Philadelphia, which is a large city. And, I can't really even remember how I stumbled onto doing this, but I basically just made a website in the early days of the internet and put out some business cards and started walking dogs in my neighborhood. and it was very full, very fast. And so next thing I knew, I had a thriving dog walking business. And I did that for many, many years and eventually wound up really specializing in dogs with reactivity and fear and aggression. And so that kind of became my specialty. But for those first few years, I just walked any and every dog in my neighborhood.
So what was it that you studied at college?
I was a theater major and an art history major. So it had nothing to do with animals at all. It was all arts for me, which maybe does make sense that I then wound up having to walk dogs to pay the bills because art history and theater do not pay your rent.
I don't know if this would be surprising or not, but I've spoken to a lot of people who are dog trainers, behaviorists, walkers, and the majority so far come from an arts background.
That makes sense to me.
Yep, arts, acting, theatre. There you go. I was like, okay, well, and it might be like my theory is that dogs bring out the purest sides of us, which I also experienced when I did drama at school. So I kind of feel like that's the only place in the modern world where you can really be yourself in front of a dog.
That makes sense. In the very few times in my life where I tried to have a normal corporate job, I was very out of place. And I remember the very first dog, Duke, that I ever got hired to walk. And I thought, you got to be kidding me. This is incredible that I'm getting paid to roll around on the ground and be silly with this dog. And yeah, you're right. It was 100% me. I didn't have to put on any airs or professional facades or anything like that. And that felt like a gift, and it remains a gift, I think. Yeah.
So did you then, because I read that you wrote a blog post that went viral, and was that part of like promoting your business as a dog walker, or did you like, what led to that?
Are you talking about dogs in need of space? Is that what? Yeah. So no, by that point I was working in animal shelters. And so I had taken a break from dog walking for a few years and gone to work full time with the dogs in an animal shelter. And I just was writing a lot about animal welfare issues. And I think I was just dog walking on the side at that point. I'm trying to put all of this into some sort of linear memory. But I think I had just returned to dog walking after maybe leaving the shelter. And I had a really bonkers walk where it was just really frustrating. And I came home and I just wrote, just a blog post to make me and my friends who were dog lovers and dog walkers laugh. And it was about dogs who need space and the people who insist that their dogs are friendly and chase you down and really will not leave you alone. And just right away, it went viral. But at that point in my life, I had been working with dogs in a lot of different capacities with dog trainers and in shelters and all kinds of ways. So it wasn't necessarily to promote anything. I think it was mostly to relieve stress from a really, really intense dog walk. And it just, it hit the spot and a lot of people read it. And I wound up creating a website called Dogs in Need of Space. And it was just my attempt to kind of stand up for and educate people around all the different reasons why dogs may not be able to interact with other dogs or people when they're out in the world. Whether they're fearful or they're sick or injured or they're service dogs, they're working, whatever it might be, that we need to respect people's wishes, that not every dog wants to meet your dog. And that, the tagline back then was, dinos are good dogs. They just need space, because there was, and there still is, kind of like a stigma. If your dog can't interact with other dogs, they're somehow perceived as broken or aggressive, or they shouldn't be out in the world. And all of my experience for however long I've been working with dogs at that point, I knew otherwise. And so it was really just about doing a little bit of public education, but mostly just pet owner support, helping people who felt really isolated with their dogs who needed space, and letting them know, you're really normal. Your dog is much more normal than you think. And there's so many people out there like you. And I think it got really popular because that was the early days of Facebook, and it was just a different time on the internet where an idea could spread. And I just wound up kind of steering that ship for a few years. And it was just a great way of kind of giving back to, I think, a lot of people that I really appreciated, particularly as an animal shelter worker. I saw how hard dog owners were trying and how committed they were to making things work with, imperfect dogs in a world that was pretty hostile to them. And so it was kind of a labor of love to support those people and those dogs. And support that bond in whatever way I could.
What took you to shelters or working in dog welfare?
So as soon as I started dog walking as a job, I started volunteering in the Philadelphia shelter system, walking dogs in the shelter. And so for me, that was really like blended together, being a dog walker professionally, volunteering in shelters. And then my husband and I moved from the city of Philadelphia to a very kind of rural part of the United States, Maine, in the Northeast. And I needed a job right away and didn't have time to like rebuild a whole business. And so I just wound up taking a job right away at my local animal shelter. And yeah, I mean, I loved it. It was incredibly challenging work, but it really shifted my career from being primarily focused on pet owners and doing that kind of private business to working much more directly in animal welfare and animal sheltering in a lot of different roles. But it really, for me, they were always like parallel tracks. The second someone hired me to be their dog walker, I was there volunteering my time at the shelter.
That's awesome. So when you look back on your time as a dog walker and then working in a dog shelter, what did you learn about dogs from that time that you might not have known growing up?
I had like 50 dogs flash through my mind. It's like just so many faces and experiences. I think just right away, I was exposed to every possible breed mix, training style, type of home environment. And I got to see all of the different ways that dogs interact with humans and how they live and how hard they're trying to make it work in this human world. And I think it just never really would have gotten, I think, the full breadth of the experience of being a dog and being in the human world if I had just been a dog owner with my one dog at a time. I mean, I really was able to interact with every kind of behavior, every kind of breed, environment, genetic issue, medical condition. And so it just helped me to see all of the different ways dogs can be. And so it just really widened that understanding. And also just I have a lot of empathy for them. They're really doing their very best to live in a world that's not suited to any of their species specific needs. And so I think I just have a lot of empathy for how hard they're trying, and for humans, how often the human beings really have no clue what they're getting into. And they're just told it's like the thing you do, you get a dog. And so they do. And they really don't know. And they have very little support. And so it was always a privilege to be a person's dog walker the first time they had a dog or the first time they adopted a dog, and to be able to kind of guide them through the really stressful, moments in the beginning of integrating this new animal into their life. So it's harder than it looks on paper or on TV. It's more complex. And I don't know that I would have ever known all of that if I had just, had kind of one dog at a time. But yeah.
How did you learn? Was it purely anecdotal, or did you do any type of training yourself in terms of dog behavior or dog training?
For me, it was mostly just like dog handling classes and dog first aid classes and that sort of thing. When I was a dog walker, just the basics of kind of pet care. Wasn't really any sort of formal training course. So it was just me with like 900 books. And this was, again, kind of like early days of the internet. So you couldn't just like log on and take a class. So I just would have a million books and I would read about everything I could. Patricia McConnell was a huge influence when I first started dog walking. I read everything that Patricia McConnell wrote, The Other End of the Leash. I would read Whole Dog Journal religiously. And I really tried to just educate myself as much as possible. And then once I was in animal sheltering, that's when, the more kind of specific training started within that profession and getting more handling training and behavior training. But I am not a dog trainer, even though I've hung out with dog trainers and co-run classes with them. I'm not the lead. I'm just there to support everybody. So I have a lot of respect for trainers and behaviorists, but that's not technically, my lane.
You probably would have made a really good dog trainer, by the way.
I don't know. I'm a pretty bad trainer, really. I really enjoy playing and being silly with dogs, but when it gets into that like really specific splicing of behavior, I am not focused enough or exacting enough to get into it. But I love enrichment and dog sports and playing and doing all kinds of stuff. But I'm really thankful to have never been a dog trainer. That's a real difficult job and my brain is not cut out for it.
I think I'm similar in that sense. Like I can't think of anything worse because I am organized, but it's organized chaos.
Yeah. And maybe that's going back to the arts, like it's like an art form kind of like, so I'm better at cooking than baking because baking has to be very precise. It's kind of the same, like caring for dogs and doing the work I've done is more of an art form, where I think behavior and training is a science.
Yeah. So maybe we're a bit more fluid.
I think so.
So then you flowed from your dog walking into welfare and shelters. And what did you learn there? But I think I'd probably like to understand, like, what was the most shocking thing that you experienced? Not in terms of the story, but like maybe it transformed your understanding of really what is involved, or what dogs go through, or things that regular people wouldn't understand that you all of a sudden had an insight into.
Well, I mean, there's no end of lessons that you learn when you're working in an animal shelter about both dogs and humans and the lack of safety nets in our world. I'm in the United States, where we have just really broken systems in our housing, and it's just really hard to be a dog owner, a pet owner in this world at the moment. When I was working in sheltering the first time, we were going through a big financial crash. It was like the 2008 housing market crash. And so we were seeing a huge influx of animals coming in because people were losing their homes. And it just became really clear that there were just no safety nets, and that animal shelters are part of like the web of human services in our communities, but often are kind of siloed or not thought of as part of these safety nets of care. And so if things are not going well for humans because of pandemics or housing market crashes or inflation or any and everything that we are going through right now, animals suffer. And so it was really clear right away that if you want to help animals, you have to help humans. And that became very clear. It's really easy to write people off as the bad guys when they are not able to keep their pets. But it's so much more complex and nuanced than that. And so that was really obvious really quickly. I think the other thing that was kind of surprising to me, and this is partially because I worked in a relatively small animal shelter, I think we only had maybe like 40 dogs at a time, was that for some of the dogs, being at the shelter was like the best life they'd ever had. And so people would come in and feel really sad for the dogs. But for me and my coworkers who took care of them every day, we actually knew that for some of them, they were really happy there. They were getting 2 meals a day. They had a regular, schedule of getting walked. They had enrichment toys and time out playing with other dogs. And they just thought, like, this is really great. I've never had this kind of regular care before. And so I think there's a tendency to always think about how sad animal shelters are, but and that is very, very true a lot of the time. But also sometimes it can be a place where animals are going and healing and relaxing for the first time in their life and really getting the medical care and housing that they've needed their whole life. And so it's not all as sad as you would anticipate or think from the outside. There's some really good stuff happening for dogs in animal shelters, and probably even more so now than back when I was working.
The shelter is a step up from what they've known. That's sad. We have a shelter here in the UK, somewhere up north. I think it's close to Manchester, actually, which is one of the first. I think they are so, innovative and pioneering in many ways, because we don't really have free roaming dogs in the UK. But in this particular shelter, they don't have kennels. The dogs look after each other.
What?
Yeah. So within that type of environment, they are free roaming, if you could call it that. But they heal each other. And I thought that was really, like, when I heard about it, I thought that was really quite remarkable.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's lovely, isn't it? So, right, moving then from dogs to humans, what was the jump? I think you just touched on it now, but if you can talk me through that, kind of like what prompted you to start working with humans.
Most of my work is in training and education. And so, I had my own experience when I was working at the shelter of compassion fatigue and burnout and ethical stress and secondary trauma and all the things that are typical occupational hazards for anyone who works in a helping profession, like not just animal sheltering, but when you work with animals or humans who are stressed or traumatized, it's likely that the workers will have these experiences. But back then, no one was talking about it, not in an accessible way for the average low-paid kennel worker. And so, I wound up having to leave the shelter and later leave another kind of dog-centered pet owner support group that I was running as a volunteer, because I really wasn't doing well. And I knew that I needed a break to take care of myself. And it was during that break that, doing my own research, I realized there's a language for what I'm experiencing. I'm not just tired. I'm not just sad. there are real things, real experiences here that I can understand myself through if I had only known that this language, this terminology existed. So, eventually I got well, but what all of my friends are in animal sheltering and animal welfare, and I was still working in animal welfare. And it became really important to me to get this information to really my friends and colleagues. My work has always been in part around education, making training materials for animal welfare groups or whatever it might be. That's kind of my wheelhouse, doing that kind of human education. And so it just made sense to me. I knew how to build online classes. I knew how to build a curriculum. And so I just put together an online course. And that was, 13, 14 years ago, with really the intent of just supporting some friends. But it became very, very popular very fast because there was a need for it. And so soon after that, I got tapped to work at a university teaching continuing education for animal welfare and veterinary medical professionals and vet students around these issues. And within a couple of years, it became really clear that this could be my full-time work. The demand was really high. So for the last decade or so, my work has really focused almost solely on supporting people who work with animals and in lots of different types of organizations. And as an educator, really providing this information so that they have the language to understand what they're experiencing and then understanding what skills or strategies, support they might, build for themselves and what organizations can do to support their workers. So it just became the focus. It was never intentional, just like I never planned to be a dog walker, but this is how life kind of plays out. And so it makes sense to me. My work has always kind of been at this intersection of supporting the humans and the animals. And so this is just like another iteration of focusing on how do we help the people? And then that allows that like ripple effect of helping that,
The
animals that I really care about. So
yeah. What kind of organizations reach out to you? Because I would assume that there is a cost involved. Like, is it the larger kind of more national?
it's everybody. Yeah, it's everybody. So I work with very small shelters that might only have like 10 or 15 people who work for them, to national organizations. I work with organizations all around the world, Canada, Australia, China, everywhere. So sometimes they work with wildlife. Sometimes they're working with bears or chimpanzees. Sometimes they're, mostly dog and cat shelters, all kinds of things. I'm working with marine mammal responders right now, stranding responders. So pretty much anyone and everyone, from huge government agencies to very, very small private rescues and shelters.
Wow. And so is it more a preemptive thing, or is it usually when something's already gone wrong?
Well, I would say it's both. There's kind of never a point in an organization where some people aren't struggling. It's kind of comes with the territory of doing this type of work. So some shelters are reaching out because they want to make sure that their people have this kind of support and training. Other times it's because there's been some sort of incident or a really difficult period, an outbreak of disease and a lot of euthanasia, or a really traumatic behavior, euthanasia, or whatever it might be. And they know that their team needs extra support. But generally speaking, I think there is an attempt at this point to be proactive about it, but getting ahead of this issue is pretty challenging because it kind of comes with the type of work that we're doing. So there's never really a time where like everybody is 100% and they can get totally ahead of this. But I would say that lots of shelters are trying to, especially at this point, maybe not so much earlier on, but now we're really trying to lay down some good pathways of education and training, for everybody within the organization before stuff happens.
Yeah, those organizations sound really lovely. Like if I was going to work in those for animal welfare, I would want to work somewhere where the culture was let's nurture, let's look after. Do you think, like, what is it that causes people to get to that point? Because I was thinking a lot recently about burnout and trauma, and I was trying to kind of reverse engineer it, because when you go into the work, you know what to expect, but what is it that causes you to reach the limit?
I actually don't think you know what to expect until you're doing the work. So I think you can think that you know what's coming, but it's not until you're doing the work day after day and really months and months into it that you start to understand the real limitations to what you can do, what resources are available. And so I think for a lot of people, you come in with really unrealistic expectations for yourself, for the organization, for the community. And you think, well, I have all of this knowledge and energy, and I'm just going to work really hard and fix it. And that's kind of, there's a lot of that in the beginning for people who work in animal welfare. And then within, 6 months, a year, 2 years, depending on the individual, depending on the environment, you hit a wall where you realize, like, despite your best efforts, you're never going to be able to fix everything, save everybody. It's not just a matter of having a lot of energy and commitment, that this is really complicated, and you as one person can't be a hero and kind of there's just a lot of unrealistic ways of thinking about what you're going to be able to do and then what a good day looks like. And so pretty quickly, people, I think, start to feel really demoralized because they're going into the work defining success as saving everybody, fixing everything. And really quickly, you realize that's not what success looks like. But it can take a while to kind of come to that realization. And we, I think, do a lot of damage to ourselves trying to outwork that. We think if we just push a little harder that, we will get to this kind of magical place where we have solved the problem and then maybe we can rest. But that doesn't really ever happen. So I think there's a tremendous learning curve that almost everyone, I really don't know anybody that goes into this work and is not surprised by how challenging, how complicated it is, and how much it forces you to kind of look at yourself. And and it's also the sheer volume of it is so overwhelming and intense. I think until you're working at that volume and that speed day after day, it's hard to kind of imagine what that feels like. And so, it's a real learning curve for most human beings, I think, who come into this with a lot of good intention, maybe some good animal skills, but that's about it. And this is not a highly professionalized field. So like, you don't have to go to school the way you would to become a nurse or a social worker. You can or even a veterinarian. You can just go work at an animal shelter after working, at a gas station. And so it's like, all kinds of people come often with a love of animals and think that will be enough. And it's just the tiniest first step towards what it really takes and the skills that you really need to be able to do the job and stay well while you do it. So I think a lot of people are in for a really, really brutal wake up once they actually get into the work.
Yeah. And probably the general public as well, because speaking only for myself, like not having, I think I volunteered a couple of times as a child. My mum took me to a rescue, and then as an adult volunteering in Thailand and Bali a little bit. But I think that those experiences were so shocking to me that it set me on this entire path that I'm on at this moment in time. But it still pales in comparison with what people have to deal with every single day, day in and day out. What are some of the trends that you've seen in terms of just people, and at what point do they need to recognize that they need help? Other than an organization reaching out to you, when would an individual typically be reaching out or need to look at reaching out to find help and support?
That's going to look really different for everybody. We get there for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes it's just plain old cumulative stress. So it's just chronic stress day after day for many, many months, and stuff starts to break down, right? We start to see some pretty significant changes in our physical, mental, emotional well-being and behavior changes. It could simply just be from that, meaning it's not something big and explosive and traumatic and really obvious. It's just like that slow burn of working incredibly hard with very few resources and not really being able to rest and recover adequately. That can get you into, kind of a place where you're really not doing well and might need some help. And for others, it is more of like an acute experience of trauma that changes you overnight. It could be that you are experiencing morally distressing situations day after day. So you're having a conflict between your values and what you're being asked to do. And again, day to day, that might be tolerable, but over time, that can really add up to moral injury. Or again, it could be one very intense experience where you really violate your moral code and you feel and you're really damaged by that. It can be all of the grief and loss that we're experiencing day after day. And again, it's like could be because of the accumulation of grief and loss. Animal welfare workers in particular, it's a very high number of animals that we're dealing with and caring for. The volume is enormous compared to other professions. So there's a lot of loss, or it could be like one very traumatic loss. And then the other part is it's all of those things at once, right? Sometimes it's one of those things, and a lot of times it's all of those things overlapping. And so for some of us, we're going to go 15 years until we hit a wall. Other people, it's 5 months and they're going to start noticing some changes. But generally speaking, like there are some common signs and symptoms. The umbrella term that I like to use for all of this is just calling it stress injury, which comes from the stress first aid model from the National Center for PTSD. And stress injury just becomes this really handy term to talk about everything I just mentioned, grief, trauma, moral distress, wear and tear. And so we can think of it that way, like I'm experiencing stress reactions, stress injury, stress illness, and then we can kind of conceptualize like where we are at any given time. And so there are some really common signs and symptoms. It's not a checklist where you have to have all of these things, but if you start to notice changes in your sleep, if you're having a hard time falling or staying asleep, if you're having nightmares, you might have intrusive thoughts or images. You might feel very hypervigilant, cynical. You might be having a lot of physical symptoms like migraines or, digestive upset. For me, I would wind up getting a head cold every 30 days because my immune system, was really shot from stress. So I would get a cold, I'd get better, I'd get sick again. We can see changes in the way that we're reacting to like emotional stimuli. We might feel very, very numb, or we might feel like we're having really disproportionate emotional reactions to things. Lots of us start to isolate ourselves, withdraw from others. We might be using substances to numb out or behaviors as a way to kind of cope that can be problematic. And there's lots of different ways that it shows up for us. And, it will depend on like, is there some trauma there? Is this more compassion or empathy fatigue and you're feeling really numb and disconnected in that sense? Are you feeling persistent sadness? Is that tied to grief and loss? Like there's a lot of different iterations of what this might look like, but those are some of like the common changes that people notice in themselves that I think wind up having them start to think like, I don't really feel like myself anymore. I'm agitated a lot, or I'm really shut down, or whatever it might be. And we can see it in each other. And that's important too, that we can notice some persistent changes in the way people are behaving that is out of character, or they're functioning differently or not functioning. And, so sometimes it's really obvious to other people that we're not ourselves, and we may not be able to see that clearly. And that's not unusual for us not to be able to. We just can't see ourselves clearly when we're in that state, but other people who know us well can say like, this is really different. You have been coming in early and staying late for weeks, or, you've been coming in late and cutting corners and not participating in meetings, and you've been really frustrated lately. Like, this is not like you. Let's talk about it. So it just depends. Lots of different pathways into it, lots of different ways that shows up in us as individuals. But I think most of us kind of at a certain point know like, oh, this is not normal for me. And it's not just a temporary reaction. This is something that's sticking around. It's persistent, and it's really starting to affect my ability to function or feel, connected and in my life.
Do you find that people have the vocabulary to describe how they're feeling or identify what is happening to them?
It depends sometimes. So there's a lot of reasons not to use the term compassion fatigue, because we've learned it's really empathic distress, and that's a whole nother conversation. And things are more nuanced. It's not just compassion fatigue. It's all of these other things. But what I find is that in animal welfare, people know that term, compassion fatigue, and that's what they will say that they have. And so I kind of continuously use the phrase compassion fatigue, even if it's not what I would choose like in an academic sense. Like it may not be technically correct, but it is what people most commonly will label their experience. And even if they don't really understand it, it's their way of saying, I'm exhausted, I'm sad or angry all the time, I can't keep doing this. And they will use that term to describe it. And so I do feel like they have the very, very basics. I think as like the internet and social media has shifted, there's a lot of like 2-minute mental health blurbs. People have a lot more therapized, way of talking and describing things. So there is more of a common knowledge or language that people can use to describe what they're experiencing. But generally speaking, people come to me and just say, my staff or I have compassion fatigue. That may not actually be what they're experiencing, but that's the term that they're most likely to use to identify what these changes that they can't quite figure out.
Experiencing, yeah. I was thinking recently about cultures within organizations where it's celebrated to kind of abandon yourself, where people get praised for how much they sacrifice and, showing up every day and not having a life. And you know what I mean by self-sacrifice. How do you come across that quite often, and how do you kind of approach that?
Yeah. So I have a little tagline in my work, and it says practicing compassionate badassery. And the idea behind that is that it takes a lot of heart and courage, the badassery part, to actually go against the cultural norms within your organization and start taking care of yourself, to set boundaries, to approach the work differently, to set those healthy limits, typically in a culture or workplace where that is not going to be celebrated. So you have to get comfortable kind of being a bit of an outsider or someone who's kind of leading on the leading edge of this, and other people might follow you. And I think that that's shifting generationally and with time, but because I think the younger generations absolutely are not okay with this idea that we martyr ourselves for the work, no matter how important the work may be. They're really pushing back on that. But most workplaces still kind of have that culture of we celebrate the workers who haven't taken a day off in 30 days, who always stay late, who never say no. And part of my work is really trying to help, leaders of people understand we should be celebrating the opposite, that we're really celebrating people who are taking their vacation days. We're making sure that there's enough coverage for everybody to take their breaks. We're not glorifying overworking, harming ourselves. So, part of my work when I talk about practicing compassionate badassery is to try to reframe kind of the old school culture of we can either take care of ourselves or we take care of the animals. That's how it's presented. So a choice between the two, meaning if you're a good person, you're obviously going to choose to take care of the animals because it would be selfish for you to choose yourself. And so I'm really pushing back on that to remind everybody it's a both and. Our welfare and the animals' welfare are inextricably linked. And so we take care of ourselves and each other and our workers. And that is what enables us to take good care of the animals in an ethical, effective, sustainable way. And that those things are equally important, right? Like my well-being is not less important than one of the animals that I'm taking care of. It is not selfish for me to take care of my needs, just like it's not selfish for an animal to, want to have its basic needs met. And so just trying to push back a little bit on that either or framing where you're either selfish or selfless, and really kind of looking to find that healthy middle ground of it's always both and. If we want to do this in a sustainable way, we can do anything for a short amount of time. We can push past all of our limits temporarily, but if we want to really make a difference long term and retain our workers and stay in the field, then we have to be part of the equation and not, blame ourselves or shame anybody else for having needs and limits that we're respecting.
Yeah. And I was just thinking actually also, isn't that like those types of, I guess, people feeling unwell, symptomatic of a broken system within that system? Because isn't that ultimately a resourcing issue? If there was enough people, I guess, or resource to be able to help, then it would spread the load a little bit easier. But I guess
it's a both and too. So absolutely our systems are broken. Our organizations are under-resourced. They're not paying people enough. The workloads are too high. I mean, there are lots and lots of systems issues here, and the organizations absolutely need to do a better job of taking care of their workers, which is the case in almost all nonprofit sectors, and certainly in animal welfare. And even if they had all the resources in the world, it's important to remember that the nature of this type of work is to be there for animals and people who are suffering, stressed, injured, traumatized, and that hurts even when you get paid well and you have adequate time off. It doesn't mean that all of those resources wouldn't make it a whole lot easier to recover from the kind of inherent pain and stress of doing this type of work. But I think it's important to recognize that this work inherently is pretty challenging and hurts even when all those pieces are in place, because that's the nature of the work. And the reason why I think I bring that up is sometimes we think, oh, if we get all those pieces in place, or if we eliminate euthanasia, then our workers will be okay. And then leaders are kind of shocked to find out, well, we gave them a pay raise and we brought in more workers, and our live release rate is sky high, like our euthanasia rates are really low. And yet still people are really struggling. And that's the reminder that, when you are exposed day after day after day to animals and people who are in crisis, that affects you if you are someone who cares and you have a lot of empathy. And so part of it is just comes with the territory of being a helping professional. So like most things, it's a both end. But yes, if I could wave a magic wand, like let's resource everybody and fix these systems 100%, because we're making it incredibly difficult and often unsustainable for people to do this work long term, regardless of how I was feeling internally. One of the reasons I had to leave the shelter was it was the lowest paying job I'd ever had in my life, and like at 30 years old. And so it made sense for me to go back to dog walking, right? Than to keep working that way. So, if you can't pay your rent or your mortgage, like it really doesn't matter. That work is unsustainable. So for sure, we need better resources for our workers.
Gosh, yeah, that must be really hard when your own well-being and own welfare is at risk. And then also having that impossible choice where you're attached to the animals and the cause, but you also have to survive at the same time. Oh, it's such a difficult job to do. I have real empathy for the people who do that day in, day out, and for years even. So I invited you onto the podcast because it was requested by someone who works at an organization who basically one of their jobs is looking at the evidence of cruelty and suffering and gathering that evidence to be able to influence change. So I speak to lots of people in rescue and everyone are feeling the same thing. But this is slightly different because it's not necessarily directly working within a rescue per se, but more a broader cause. And so the level of suffering is the scale is so much bigger, like just enormous. Where does someone start to take care of themselves as well as their colleagues when you're trying to tackle something so big?
Many people doing this work, if they're not doing direct care, they're exposed to a lot of photos and videos of animal cruelty, right? Yeah. And abuse and violence. And so what I have found helpful is kind of going to journalists and looking at the ways that they protect themselves when they are really surrounded by trauma all of the time in their reporting. And there's some pretty concrete skills that they bring into the way that they do the work. So first, it's the understanding that viewing trauma, even if you are, it's secondhand, so you are in your office looking at these photos or videos online, like you're not necessarily out in the field, that is still legitimate trauma exposure, and you can experience secondary traumatic stress symptoms, which are the same as primary traumatic stress symptoms. You can experience PTSD from both. And so first, just taking it really seriously that the volume of trauma exposure is going to play a part in your experience. The higher your exposure levels are, like the more at risk you are. And so we're taking that really seriously. And then we're looking at what, by any means necessary, how do we try to reduce the exposure while still doing the work? And so, it sounds kind of straightforward and technical, but there are a lot of tips and tricks for looking at these videos and photos in ways that minimizes how you're absorbing the content. So it's doing a lot of decision making around, like, if I have to watch the video, do I also have to listen to the sound? Or can I do my job without hearing it? Or vice versa? Or do I have to look at the entire photo? Or can I put a viewfinder on my screen and block out some of that? Like, what parts of this do I have to engage with in order to do my job effectively? And then literally like blocking out or reducing anything that you don't have to expose yourself to. Understanding that it's not just the one photo or video, it's the cumulative nature that you're pushing back on. It's about having a lot of grounding skills and taking a lot of breaks so that you are not losing yourself in the material. So that might be, alarms or bells that remind you to literally pull your eyes away from the screen and to look outside or look at plants or animals in your house to try to reset your nervous system and come back into the present moment. It's using a lot of grounding skills while you're looking at these images so you don't lose contact with your own body while you are viewing this material. I think it's also about having rituals at the end of the day that allow you to kind of transition out of that so that you're not carrying all of that with you all of the time. And then it's looking at like the rest of your life, because what a lot of people who do this work do is they also have feeds that are full of photos and videos from other organizations that are showing, graphic photos or videos. And I would just suggest that if it is not needed for your job, that you do not look at any other traumatic material, again, with the understanding that the higher your trauma exposure is, the higher your risks are. And you can only do so much to control what you're looking at in your job, but you have a lot of control about what you're looking at or experiencing outside of your work. And I find that a lot of people in animal welfare feel a moral obligation to bear witness to all of it. And what I would just say is that if you want to continue to do this work, you have to be really selective about the amount of traumatic material you're allowing yourself to witness. And so it's not abandoning those animals by not looking at that material. It's taking care of yourself so you can keep doing the work. Like if your job was to make widgets all day, you worked in a car factory, then maybe you would have a moral obligation to look. But you do this work day in and day out. Like you are doing it. You're doing your part to bear witness and to end the suffering. You don't have to also take in all of the suffering in the world. No person is really built to take in that much content, that much suffering, that much tragedy day after day after day. It's just a recipe for harm. And so if someone is struggling with kind of, I think the ethical part of like, I feel obligated to bear witness, just really try to frame it for yourself as a way of sustaining your ability to help animals, is to be very selective about what you allow yourself to take in. And then having a lot of concrete and practical rituals and end of day practices and debriefing that allow you to move some of that, what you've witnessed that day, out of your mind and your body. So you're not just replaying it, all night as you try to fall asleep. And so we're kind of stuck in that really activated state all of the time, and taking really good care of yourself all of the time, because it seems almost obnoxious to say it, but when we are exposed to this much and we're working this hard, if we are not getting adequate rest, like literal sleep, we can't process all of this. We can't repair. We can't organize our, memories and these images in a way that's helpful for us. So, making sure that you're taking care of those basics, while it might sound so obvious and obnoxious for me to say that, I know that most people are not taking care of those basics. And so prioritizing, even if you're not going to take vacations, you're not going to do a lot of like time intensive self-care, if you can prioritize making sure your basic biological needs are met consistently, you're going to be a lot more resilient to what you are witnessing and have that time to repair and recover when you're not doing the work. We have to take that really, really seriously, because most of us are treating, just like at a baseline, our physical well-being as an afterthought. And that really affects our ability mentally and emotionally to cope effectively with what we're bearing witness to every day.
I do want to slightly go back to the ethical stress and then the moral injury. I find those really interesting, probably personally more from a philosophical perspective, but like, how do you psychologically organize things in your brain when that's the thing that fuels the whole thing? You know what I mean? Your whole entire purpose is fueled by the ethical and moral quandary, if you could call it that, right? Like wanting to put the world to rights and say that's not okay, and actually putting your actions where your thoughts are, you know what I mean? Instead of just talking about it, I guess. So how does one psychologically organize or reconcile with those things to be able to survive doing the work that you are so passionate about?
So I will say that I'm not an expert on moral injury. My friend, Dr. Jamie McNally is, and I would be happy to share her information because she also just published a paper that came out, I think just in the last few weeks, on moral injury in animal shelter workers. And she's a tremendous expert resource on this topic, but I've learned a lot from her and other teachers over the years. And part of this is, I think, first, literally just being aware of what it is, and that ethical stress and moral injury are different than empathic distress or secondary traumatic stress or grief and loss. So just having the language to understand and conceptualize, like, okay, what the stress I'm experiencing right now is because I've had to violate my values in some way, or I have watched someone else within my organization or community, violate those ethics or values. And so it sounds simplistic, but even being able to understand that that is something different and it's a different type of stress, I think can be helpful, because the way that we begin to kind of cope with and repair some of these moral or ethical stressors and wounds is a little bit more, in my view, nuanced and complex than some of the other work that is done. Because you're kind of right. It's a lot of like conceptualizing and working through in your mind, what feels right for you and where the lines are and how might I be like ethically drifting, in the choices I'm making day to day. What is okay for me now? I've watched so many people over the years, myself included, shift our conception of where our ethical lines are, because we recognize with time how complicated, complex, and nuanced the situations we're working in are. So what felt very black and white, and therefore like a very clear ethical violation for us in the beginning, now we feel much differently about some of these situations where we have a little bit more of an expansive view. And then that supports us in doing things that are not so clear, that we're dealing with a lot of situations where there are no good, clear, good or right choices to be made. Everything is a bit of a dilemma in the work that we're doing with the lack of resources. So kind of, how do we learn to think through compassionately, ethically reasoning? For me, the harm reduction model has been really helpful in kind of shifting the way that I think about a lot of the choices that we have to make, that we're often not going to get the ideal circumstances for animals or people, but we can reduce the amount of harm that's being done to animals. We can make things less terrible for them. And, I think when we kind of circling back to how we started this conversation to some degree, we come in, really thinking we know what is right and wrong, and success is getting to that place where, there are clear bad guys, there are clear good guys, and we're saving animals and we're getting them to like ideal situations. And most of us with time and through some really painful experiences, I think, start to realize it's just so much more complex than that. Good people do bad things, quote unquote, bad people do good things. And often there are no clear right choices to be made. And so how do we reduce the harm and then redefine that as success in the work that we do? And that will look different for everybody. Like, we're all allowed to have different values in this work. And I think that's also a point of stress within a team, is that we kind of go in thinking we all have the same values, the same ethics around animals. And that's not true either. Even within an animal welfare organization, there are people with vastly different conceptions of what is okay and not okay to do with and to and for animals. So it's really nuanced. I think part of working with ethical stress, moral injury is being very clear about what your values are and recognizing, if I've done something that does violate my moral code, what can I do tomorrow or today is an expression of that value. Like, I can't undo what was done. Maybe I couldn't stop that thing from happening. I don't have that kind of institutional power, but what can I do today that is that value in action? And that is a way for me to kind of counterbalance some of the things I've had to do that I'm not so comfortable with. But I will say that, like, repeatedly having to kind of violate your own values or be in that type of conflict does drive a lot of burnout in the field. So part of all of this, and why I would love for people to check out Dr. Jamie McAnally's work is that we really need to be able to have more complex conversations about values and ethics in our work and with real skill, which is challenging. Like we need help having difficult conversations around these topics because it is a part of the job that drives a lot of people out without them even really being able to articulate what they've done or experienced. And so that's a real like leading edge in this work, is understanding moral injury and ethical stress within our work and how it's different than other things. And often there are not clear, tidy answers to a lot of how we repair that. But I think just understanding it to begin with is helpful.
That's super interesting. I feel like that's an entire episode on its own, isn't it? So I was reading a book basically about morality, and it was talking about how we kind of live in an age of moral sovereignty where we move through the world where we don't want to violate our personal values and ethics, but we also put ourselves on a pedestal at the same time, which make us more rigid in the process. And therefore that kind of, it hurts even more because you're not just violating yourself, but you're also violating yourself through the perception of other people's viewpoint, if that makes sense, especially if you make your entire life about drawing a line.
Yeah.
Right?
I think this is where there's so much like nuance and discernment around this, because on one hand, I think we have to be a lot more flexible. If we're going to stay well and be effective, like truly effective in our work, we need a lot more flexibility around this type of thinking. And we also all have a bottom line. It's more effective to have both. A bottom line that we will not violate and then a lot of flexibility around it. But if we're just super rigid, we're going to constantly feel like we're violating our sense of right and wrong that everyone else is also. And it's going to be really difficult to come together to make any sort of effective change for animals and people that we want to see happen. I'm not trying to tell anybody to be like morally ambiguous and wishy-washy, but I do think that the flexibility actually like allows you to have a more firm line that you won't cross and know what that is and hold that line with confidence. But that flexibility, I think, is what keeps a lot of people well in the work and doing the work in a way that actually makes the change happen that they would so like to see. That rigidity could get a lot of us in a lot of trouble, but it's hard to even articulate it without sounding like I'm telling people like, who cares about your value? Like, yeah, just flexibility is not a bad word is what I'm trying to say. And I think that often experience and learning the hard way that maybe you perceive something incorrectly or in a judgmental or, lacking in compassion kind of way and realizing, I really didn't know what I was talking about back then. You start to realize like with age and experience, okay, I really never know. I don't know a lot of the time. Like the more I learn, the less I actually know about anything. And so maybe I don't want to be so rigid. Maybe I want to stay a little bit more curious and flexible. And I think that really supports us doing the work and allows us to really make a difference.
Yeah. And so I guess ultimately that compassion that we extend to others, one must extend to ourselves at the same time, right?
100%.
A can of worms over there. I honestly have really enjoyed this. You are so articulate and I feel like I could listen to you speaking for hours. Where can people learn more about the work that you do? Do you have anything available online?
Yeah, so you can find me at jessicadolce.com. And if you are curious about upcoming classes or anything that I'm offering, just subscribe to my newsletter. I stopped using social media about 6 years ago, so I'm not on any social, I know. But I know it makes it a little harder to find me, but basically just go to my website, my name, jessicadolce.com, and that's where you can find my work.
I love that. How do you survive?
I don't know, but it's happened. I'm able to do it. So it is.
That's incredible. That is my dream.
One day. Trade-off. I'm sure I've lost, some opportunities along the way, but my day-to-day life is a little bit better because I'm not doing social. Yeah.
That's good. And do you ever come to the UK for conferences and seminars and things like that?
I haven't been, but I would love to. And I'm hoping to get to Scotland actually next year or the year after. But I went to the University of East Anglia for 6 months when I was in college. And so I've been trying to get back to Norwich for a million years. I really love it there. So I would absolutely love to come back to England or Scotland.
Yeah. UEA is an amazing university. I used to work with them.
Well, I was an art
Really
history
cool.
student, and they have a great art history program.
Really cool. Well, I know that there are lots of people within the welfare sector who listen to this podcast. So if you want to, get in touch.
If you want to hang out.
Yeah, that would be cool. Amazing. Well, Jessica, I'm very, very grateful for your time. It's so generous of you to join me on the podcast. And I wish you well. And thank you so much for all the amazing work that you do.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.